artificial intelligence architect who works with leading edge technologies in the commercial and defense space. A Google Moonshot and an IBM Watson winner, and who is proud to support diverse talent to create a better world. And to you, Oliver, floor is all yours.
Yes, hello, well, welcome back, and wherever you are, welcome to another Disruptive Technologists. We're going to be discussing the metaverse and really how we got here. With me tonight is Vint Cerf, the American internet pioneer and father of the internet. Also joining him is Noreen Whysel, the Director of Validation Research at ME2B Alliance, and a good colleague. Vint is going to be joining us a little later on. He's wrapping up another call as we speak, so he'll be on shortly.
Actually, I'm already on.
Oh, you are? Fantastic. Well, welcome back.
Yeah, I managed to jump off the call promptly, the other one that I was on. So I'm here to annoy you.
We love
Wonderful.
you, Vint.
That's great.
Thank you.
So I thought, without further ado, I thought we'd actually start with a quote from Alice in Wonderland, where Alice asked, "Would you tell me, please, which way I ought to go from here?" And the cat replied, "Well, that depends a great deal on where you want to get to." Let's start with the first question, which is, how did we really get here? And was it inevitable? Vint, you helped create an awful lot of the internet as we know it, a lot of the structure. Do you think we were always going to reach this point of a somewhat controlled internet?
No, I don't think that this was assured or guaranteed. First of all, it wasn't clear the technology was going to work. That's what the ARPANET project was for, to show that packet switching could actually be used to solve some really fundamental problems for intercomputer communication among different brands of computers. Second, there was no guarantee that its use in the command and control context with the different kinds of networks that Bob Kahn contemplated, the packet radio net, packet satellite net, the original ARPANET, Ethernet that showed up at Xerox PARC at about the same time in 1973. No guarantee that we'd figure out how to actually get all that heterogeneous networking assembled to look like a uniform thing. Third, the idea that you would tell people, okay, so this is what's going to happen. We're going to build this demo. And then we're going to go build like crazy versions of this particular set of protocols on every operating system we can find. And then we're going to force everybody to use it that's on the Defense Department sponsored networks. And then the Department of Energy, the National Science Foundation, and NASA are all going to buy in spite of the fact that the Open Systems Interconnection model, which got launched in 1978, just as we're freezing the internet, is hammer and tongs coming after us through an international standards organization, which most governments said, oh, well, of course we should adopt that because it's already an international standard. And who the hell are these US military, people anyway, and why would we want to have anything from them? Apart from the fact that we gave it away. I mean, we basically said, here's the spec. If you want to build it, it should work. And by the way, we tested it. And then we would say, oh, and guess what? We're not going to charge each other for carrying each other's traffic. It's just going to be a peering relation. We all benefit from carrying each other's traffic. So there won't be any charging mechanism, except maybe at the edges, where somebody has to pay for the equipment to push data in and receive data coming out. But we didn't dictate any business models for anybody. Some huge number of interconnection agreements among all the tens of thousands of networks of the internet are on a handshake basis with no exchange of revenue. Now, if I had sat down in 1973 and I told you, this is how it's going to work, and oh, by the way, in 1991, Tim Berners-Lee is going to come up with this thing he calls the World Wide Web, and it's going to take off like a rocket. You'd look at me and ask, what have I been smoking? and, or shooting up or whatever. And so even though I still am and was then and am now totally committed to getting this thing in the hands of everyone who wants to use it and doing everything I can to keep it as open as possible, to resist the desire to build barriers around it, to prevent the free flow of information, the indexing and discovery of information. I will fight tooth and nail for that. But the other guys have all the guns. So I don't think this was inevitable, and I didn't let myself imagine that it was inevitable, but that didn't keep me and tens of thousands of other people being committed to trying to make it happen. And that is going on today.
I'll come back to your comment about openness in a second. Noreen, you've been involved in a lot of the standards for some time. Do you think they're still fit for purpose? I mean, what's your feelings about the internet we have today versus where it came from and those ideals?
Well, I can go back to the beginning. I started designing for the internet probably 1992 or maybe even earlier. And I kind of picked up on what you were saying at the beginning when you said it depends, because that's kind of a user experience designer's mantra, right? It always depends on the context and your ability to create something online. And early on, when the internet was largely web-based, it was very easy to see what everybody else was doing. You can open up the code. It was very almost craft-based. And these small communities kind of developed around this idea that there is this new technology and everybody can kind of look under the hood and see, what people are doing. And you could follow those standards and understand, how everything is supposed to work and build something really interesting and creative. And then as new technology started coming in, mobile applications are much more black box, closed off. You don't really see, what's going on. Maybe you can get the JavaScript, and take a look at what people have been doing, but it wasn't as open as it was before. And a lot of new frameworks started coming out for developing on the web. And it became very much around, understanding those frameworks all the way up to, a lot of websites are on WordPress. So if you know Gutenberg, it's, it makes it a lot easier for you to understand those websites. From the standards perspective, where I'm working right now is the Me2Be Alliance. And we started out describing ourselves as a new kind of standards organization, but we're really kind of moving past the idea of being a standards organization, largely because a lot of standards are basically the working groups in a lot of these standards are populated by people who work for those large businesses. And I remember, I want to say it was around 2012, I went to a W3C multimodal interaction event. And everybody in the room, except for me and a couple of other people, were in big publishing. And they were all directing the standard toward, whatever, the media companies that they belonged to, what they were developing in-house. So it's kind of like, you want to be part of these open standards communities. You want to understand how the technology is moving so that you can stay on top of designing and developing for those different standards. And there are standards that I really am a proponent of that I really like. The ARIA standard at W3C, all of the accessibility standards are, I think, really important and help you to develop a more inclusive web. But it's harder to see, how people are developing the website when you can't really see under the hood as well.
Well, let's keep to that point just for a little bit. Vint, do you see the standards and who is controlling them as a threat to the open internet? Has the internet been ceded to nation state and some very, very large corporations?
Well, first of all, the attempt by the Chinese to introduce new IP failed miserably, as far as I'm concerned. There's a piece of it dangling around somewhere in one of the committees in the ITUT, but doesn't have a whole lot of what's the right word? Traction. I was amused when Noreen said, "Let's go back to the beginning," and then she says 1992, and pardon me. Beginning is 1969 in my diary, anyway.
My other.
Yeah. But I want to emphasize several things. First one is that there are a number of different organizations that contribute to the pieces that make up the internet. Some of those pieces have been invented, of course, well past the early stages of just getting packet switching to work. So the World Wide Web being a good example, since that shows up in 1991, whereas a lot of the other stuff came decades earlier. I would like to emphasize the differences among the various standards activities that influence the way the internet operates. The Internet Engineering Task Force is a remarkable organization. It's part of the Internet Society now. Before, it was literally supported by government grants from DARPA and NSF and so on. But what's peculiar about it is you can't join. All you can do is show up. There's no membership list. You just show up. If your ideas are attractive, people will adopt them, and if they're not, they won't. And that's it. You check your guns at the door for the most part. The World Wide Web Consortium is quite different. The IETF has an antipathy for intellectual property constraints on ideas. And so its standards are almost always bereft of licensed technology. They try very hard not to adopt things that require licensing. Unless it's a defensive license where the party offers the license free of charge and just doesn't want to be prevented from exercising its own invention. The W3C got started in a very different context, and there are much more intellectual property concerns there. There are a lot of agreements that are part of the participation of the members in that organization. The IEEE is focused on the lower layers of the architecture, and it's a mixed bag when it comes to intellectual property constraints. So that's, one thing is to observe the different standards organizations as operating with different practices. The other thing that I think may be important to recognize is, although the World Wide Web element of the internet it's layered on top of a whole bunch of other stuff. Not everything is going through the web. Not everything is HTTPS or HTTP. A lot of it is triggered by those interactions, and then some other protocol takes over and does streaming video and streaming audio. What we're doing right now, for example, has a number of protocols that are being used in order to produce the result. They're not all running necessarily on HTTP. I only mention that because we shouldn't allow ourselves to think of the internet as being oversubscribed or limited. The design was open enough that you could keep building more protocols at each horizontal layer, and if you needed to, you could stick another layer on, which is what Tim Berners-Lee did with HTTPS. So, and now I'm just rattling away here, reacting to Noreen. I want to come back to your question, which is, are we in a state now where the internet's going to become increasingly constrained and tight and and less open than it was before? And the answer is there is risk of that. Part of the risk is that governments see bad things happening on the net and they want to protect their citizens. Some governments want to protect themselves, they have different motivation for control. But however it's motivated, whether it's to keep the government from being attacked by the citizens or it's trying to keep the citizens from being attacked by bad guys, it leads to more desire for control over the internet by governments, who then appeal to the 350-year-old treaty or Peace of Westphalia, 1648, many of you know, and which settled an enormous number of disputes. I mean, it was really a truly remarkable event, took place over months, and resulted in the notion of sovereignty. And this is a very important construct, and it's been with us for quite a long time. what's happened is that in the digital world, it is now popular to speak of data sovereignty and to interpret that as meaning that if there's data about my citizens, it should stay in my country. And, and there's this barrier around the edge and we won't let anybody touch it except us, meaning the government. And to be quite frank, sometimes the government's that so that they can get access to the data by demand and nobody else can.
Absolutely. So, actually, Noreen, I'll follow up with you on that. Data sovereignty, is it the right fit for what we really need to be looking at today, or is it and are the standards we have a good fit for the sort of freedoms that we want? What's been your experience with current standards?
I feel like we're kind of operating in this paradigm that's dictated by those governments and the rules that they create. So things like GDPR, CCPA in California, and various other laws that are trying to address our data privacy are kind of wrapped around this idea of data as property, and often as data as property held by some database, not by brains, right? So our personal data privacy, that's a really, really new idea. And I don't know that the data standards, I don't know that that is addressing those issues, that understanding of what exactly is personal data and how legally is it our property. Yeah, so I'd be interested to know if there, is something out there that's trying to figure that out from a standards perspective, because right now it feels like the legal perspective is kind of overshadowing it all.
It's really weird. If I could jump in, Oliver.
Totally weird.
Yeah, and the reason it's so weird is that the notion of ownership is different from access to. And the concerns about data privacy are more about access and control of access than it is who owns it. So regardless of who owns the data, I might still want to say something about who gets access to it. My willingness to share the data may be dependent upon the willingness of the other party to control access. So when I hear countries saying we want to build this, Chinese firewall around the country, my reaction is, wait a minute, that's not really going to do what you want it to do. First of all, it may not protect it any better than any other place. But if cryptography is your friend, which it should be in this case, then if you want to protect access to something, you can encrypt it and then decide who gets the keys. Then you might say there are terms and conditions associated with getting keys to the encrypted data. If you fail to meet the criteria, there may be consequences. You might want legal frameworks in which there is accountability for and liability for abuse of access to information. So I see this as a mechanism for access control, which doesn't require us to build, boundaries around various pieces of the internet, but rather to build access control mechanisms, which, by the way, also induce some other things like strong authentication, strong identity, the ability to prevent someone from pretending to be you and doing things that you didn't want them to do or that you wouldn't do. So all these authentication things and the cryptographic means about them are really important, but they operate at layers in the architecture which don't require us to build barriers between the free flow of information across the underlying internet.
And it's going to be a big thing in the metaverse, because right now we are kind of used to accepting cookies or, adjusting our cookie settings and other, access settings. So there's also this big idea that the Me2B Alliance is really developing around the consumer having some say. But what happens when you're completely immersed in a metaverse? I mean, we're already kind of immersed in this kind of dataverse thing that's going on around us in the physical world through the, devices that we have. But once you're in this metaverse, are you going to be so dazzled by it, so immersed in it that you don't really understand or notice these different, tracking that's happening? It knows where you're going in the space that it created. It may be sending you messages that you wouldn't necessarily notice as an advertisement because you're completely immersed in that situation. So that's concerning.
And actually, for both of you, is the metaverse something you're excited about, fearful of, or just wait and see?
I'll let Noreen respond first. I have an answer to that.
Yeah, I mean, my kids are they're digital natives. They're in their 20s. They've been, ever since they were on my lap when they were a year old, playing CD-ROM games. Back then it was all CD-ROM, a little bit of internet stuff. They build worlds in, I guess they're doing Dragon Age right now. They spend hours on character development, and they spend hours building these houses and things like that their characters live in. And it's really fascinating to me. But I also see that they, just from their own personal identity experience, they don't really think of themselves as that avatar. It's just some character that they created, and then maybe the next time they go on, they create a completely new character. But I also remember when they were very young, Second Life was kind of starting up in the mid 2000s. And I was in an organization, the Information Architecture Institute, which used to rent office space from NYU Law in Second Life, where we would have meetings and we would have presentations and sometimes invite people in. And there were also a lot of political things, events that you could go to or conferences that you could go to. And that was really interesting because in that case, you're actually creating an avatar who's you, who represents some aspect of you. Yeah, I mean, it was a really interesting and exciting world. There were a lot of adjustments that you had to make for how you move your character around. It certainly wasn't seamless. Lots of like using the arrow keys and mouse and things like that. Yeah, so I think that could be really exciting. Right now, it's not that exciting. I mean, I think the closest experience I've had to anything like that, because I don't have the VR headset, is going to like a Gather Town or Hop In, conference where you're like this little, 8-bit thing kind of going from room to room and maybe talking with somebody, and a window will pop up like the ones that we're seeing right now. Are you
feeling happy to use, say, Zuckerberg's version of the metaverse and of the VR gear that's out there?
I'm a little worried about it, actually. I'm a little worried about it. And I also don't want to be that, old lady, who's, he's laughing again. I have 20-year-olds and they're used to this. And I'm like, kind of, moving my way around in it, trying tentatively to see what's going on. So yeah, I'm a little worried about that. I mean, just taking Zoom calls, I've had like voice dysphonia therapy because of the way that you have to express yourself in order to get the floor in Zoom. What kinds of things like that are going to be in the metaverse for people who, are prone to these kinds of things? Or are we creating a generation of kids who are going to have no problem with that because they're so used to, talking to each other, in these spaces?
Fantastic. Ben, what do you think?
Well, first of all, I'm not yet totally sold on the metaverse. My kids are a little older than Noreen's. They're in their 40s. One is getting on close to 50, which tells you something about how old I must be. What surprised me is that the younger one was describing how he was using a virtual and Oculus headset or someone's, I don't remember which, and to exercise. And I said, well, exactly what are you doing? He says, I'm boxing. And I said, wait a minute, let me get this straight. You stick this thing on your face so you can't see anything except what it shows you. And now you're dancing around the room. How do you keep from, running into the wall and falling out the window? And I guess the answer is, well, the virtual reality thing draws some boundaries that are functionally determined by how big the room is that you're moving around. And I said, well, what about tripping over the furniture? And he says, well, you've got to move that out of the way. So he's saying that he actually gets a pretty good workout out of this. Well, that was a surprise for me. I didn't anticipate that. I thought, you know, if you're going to do that, you needed a padded room, which also implies other things like, you know, you must be crazy. So, so that surprised me. I think that there will be plenty of entertainment arising out of this. I think there will be proprioception problems. That's a 50-cent word, which means that your body is getting signals from one sense, like your eyes, that are not matched by your semicircular canals or the muscles in your legs. And it becomes very confused, and some people get nauseous or nauseated. I'm sorry, nauseated. Whenever somebody says, I'm nauseous, you can say, yeah, you sure are. I hope I don't have to look at you anymore. It's a little language lesson that you want to give people. So I am persuaded that there will be conditions under which this metaverse notion will turn out to be interesting and useful. For example, here's a crazy thought. Suppose a bunch of us decided we were going to do some research. And we said, well, let's meet at the library. And which one? Well, this metaphysical library, which is in the metaverse. And when we go into the conference room, it's bookshelves. Its e-book shelves are already populated with everything we need. We can pull things off the shelf. We can open them up. We can take the books apart if we want to. You know, the pages are, you know, we can mix and match and do all kinds of things. We can get things to happen that simulate an environment that we couldn't even create in the real world. And so, I can see that as being an attractive exploration. However, think about what we're doing right now, and imagine we're doing it in the metaverse, and we're all wearing these, headsets. Well, if our cameras were showing us, we'd all look like Darth Vader, and so probably nobody wants to look like Darth Vader. Okay, well, there are a few people who might. So what happens as a result of that is that people say, oh, okay, there must be a market in making you look good in this metaverse. And so, I would have hair and, maybe my beard would be a little darker. And by the way, you have to wear something, in this space. So what do you wear? And maybe you can rent, I could rent 3-piece suits from Ralph Lauren or something for $5 a month. So you can imagine businesses building around making people feel comfortable in the metaverse, looking maybe better than they really do, which now leads you to wonder, I wonder what this person actually looks like. What's reality in this space? I have no good answers for you there. I just don't know what to tell you. But being unable to tell the difference between the metaverse and the real world could become very, very disconcerting, which is why the deep fake question makes me uneasy, because the metaverse could generate a substantial quantity of such things. So now that leaves us with the question, can we teach people, ourselves and our kids, to exercise critical thinking so they can distinguish what's real from what is imagined or is fabricated? And are they willing?
That was the question I was going to ask. Well, the first question I have to ask, which I'm sure the audience wants to know, is have you tried VR boxing?
I have not. I have not. And I'm a little hesitant to do that because I'm afraid I trip over my own feet.
And then do you think, and this is for Noreen as well, do you think we'll become more separated from society and possibly more vain as we fall into the metaverse more?
We kind of already are, aren't we? Which one of us doesn't have the make me look better filter on right now?
No, tell me more. This sounds much more important.
There is a story that people on this call should read. It was written in 1909 by E.M. Forster, a very well-known author. The story was called The Machine Stops. It was about a society where everyone lived at home. The machine delivered food and provided the ability for people to communicate with each other remotely. Now, remember, the telephone had been invented some 30 plus years before, but television was in the future. Forster imagines this thing, and then, of course, the opening lines, the machine stops. It stops working. What happens to that society? Well, we are kind of that society, especially with the pandemic. And so you should read this to find out what happens to, at least in E.M. Forster's vision of what happens to a society that was dependent on this and that went away.
Noreen, are you seeing the same thing, a stopped society?
I mean, yeah, I live in New York City, and if it weren't for the people who are delivering things during the pandemic, it would have been really, really hard to live here. And I think there's always going to be people who will fill in those roles, but there's a huge risk that it becomes, and has become even, a bifurcated society, where you have like the time machine thing, the Eloy, and I can't remember the other group, where you have like a servant class and somebody who is very dependent on that servant class, but also, sees themselves as elevated. And so I've heard of people talking about, Web3 being this really, great thing that will elevate people from having to do those drudgery jobs. But then how do you get packages delivered to you? If everybody in the world is doing nothing but mining coin. So there's a lot of kind of ethical, moral, political issues that we need to really work out, to understand, what that kind of world, what the risks are of creating that kind of world.
So, what Noreen is saying tells me that we should do something that Xerox PARC did way back in 1972 when the Ethernet was invented and the Alto machine was invented. The 250 people at Xerox PARC got workstations, and they were living in a world 20 years in the future. And so Xerox, because the guy who was running part of the operation was Bob Taylor, who had been the director of the Information Processing Techniques Office, which led to the ARPANET. Taylor hired anthropologists and sociologists and neuropsychologists to try to understand how people's behavior was affected by having this technology. And I really wish that we at Google and other places had more of that kind of talent around to help us understand the consequences of some of the choices that we make, the designs that we develop, because we might get some insight from that and maybe anticipate problems before they happen.
Noreen, how do you think we could build a better, I was going to say a better internet, but better digital technology? Is it a case of much better diversity, something more open with more access?
I do really like open access, diverse development, making sure that the people who are envisioning that future aren't the people who are, the ones who are in power right now. Is interesting. I was just thinking about this video from Apple from like the early or late 70s, early 80s, where they're envisioning the future. And yet the biases of that era were still showing through in that vision. It was still a man in the corporate office with a secretary who was, making his lunch appointments, even though he had an iPad-like thing that he was, creating his plan for the day. And we always look at the future based on the biases that we have in the current day. And so you have to really think about how is society going to change and what biases do we have that we need to let go of when we're envisioning that future, so that you create something that's actually going to be good for everybody and that's going to be a safe place for everybody to live in. Or it may not happen at all, It may be that it's just these kind of augmented experiences that we participate in, that isn't something that we completely immerse ourselves in. Because we will decide that we don't want to have the exposures to those risks of being tracked, of being, social engineered into, certain kinds of behaviors.
So you think maybe as a society we'll self-police, or maybe just on an individual level we'll stop at a certain point if it's not open enough?
I'm not going to say that that's my prediction because I don't know what the future is going to bring. And I do worry about the social engineering of our society right now, and where we might be going, and the fact that the regulatory things, they work at the speed of government, which is not very fast. It's certainly not as fast as technology. So what you need to have is people who have that kind of watchdog role to make sure that people are understanding what their data rights are, what their physical rights are even in these spaces, and what kinds of damages and harms might affect them that can be mitigated somehow through the way that we plan for those future activities online.
So this actually brings up a really important point, Noreen. It has to do with what's the framework in which people are protected. Mm-hmm. And because the internet doesn't recognize the passage of traffic across international boundaries, the IP address space was designed to be topological, but not organized around country codes. It's true that we have domain names that include country codes, but they also have the generic ones like .net and .org and so on, .com, that are non-country specific. So they're both classes up at the domain name level, and down at the internet level it's completely invisible. The consequence of that is that the system as currently operating allows a party in one jurisdiction to interact with a party in a different jurisdiction, potentially causing harm, which leads one to two problems. One is, how do you hold people accountable for bad behavior? How do you uncover any hiding that they've done in an attempt to be anonymous? And how do you get cooperation from another nation state to track down the parties who are causing harm? And how do you agree on what's harmful? How do you agree on reciprocity? There's a whole series of things like this that are still in debate, as you probably are well aware, not only within the European Union, but elsewhere in the UN, and in the effort that the Secretary General of the UN has promoted. The digital cooperation notion implies, to me anyway, the potential for nations to work together to uncover bad behavior and to bring it to justice.
And every jurisdiction seems to have a different definition of what those harms are and what that bad behavior is. The California law defines dark patterns as UI patterns that, cause harm, basically. But it's not really very detailed understanding of what these patterns are that should be avoided or that should not be included. And then also all of these other states in the United States are having their own privacy data regulations. There's a regulation in Virginia, in California. There's one in New York that is on its way. And a number of, I think Ohio as well, and a number of other states are working on their own regulations. And it's going to, one of the things that I like have this hope for is that it's going to make the companies say, I don't want to have to deal with all of these regulations. I want my users now to tell me, what I can do, rather than me trying to enforce this on them, because then otherwise I have to make sure that I have compliance in all these different jurisdictions. Or you go to the most stringent jurisdiction and you say, okay, we're gonna follow that law.
Well, one possibility, of course, is that if you get diversity among the states, just looking at the US for a second, when you get diversity among the states and there is an interstate component to it, the federal government has legitimate reason to step in to say this needs to be more uniform across the states. And that's what the Congress can do by passing laws that apply to all states. So that doesn't stop a state from trying to be more stringent, perhaps, than the federal government. But it may be impossible to be less stringent than whatever the federal rules are. And of course, this just gets more complicated when you start asking what happens on an international scale. I'm frankly hoping that there will be at least some agreement on how we should protect people from harm in the online environment. What do they need to know? What does digital literacy mean? And how do we agree on a common basis for reciprocity to protect people? And as I said before, there are some governments that just want to be protected from their populations. as opposed to protecting their populations. But setting those aside for a moment, I think there is reason to hope that there will be some commonality. It probably will never be quite uniform, but your argument about companies trying to deal with conflicting guidance is very real. It's a tough problem, and frankly, speaking for myself, I hope we can find a way out of that thicket.
And I hope it's not, all of these little toggle switches that we have to, yeah. It's hard enough to like find out where the location setting is on your phone, and now. It's
crazy. Imagine, we haven't touched on this, Oliver, but imagine for just a moment that we have several metaverses that have been invented. Some of us think it would be really cool if you could move from one metaverse to another and you could invite a friend to come in. I'm not 100% clear how to get that to happen because it didn't work with instant messaging. It worked okay with email. Email kind of is interoperable pretty much broadly. Instant messaging didn't happen, and there are reasons for that. You had to know what the other guy's installed base was in order to correctly tell somebody. There's someone that you normally correspond with online in another, instant messaging system, and they didn't like that. So I'm hoping, though, that somehow we come to common standards enough that the metaverse will allow us to move back and forth. But I can imagine that there are going to be business reasons that will inhibit that kind of openness.
Maybe, but it sounds like you're describing a really good party.
Well, we come on over to my place. We have better meta booze than they do.
Exactly. Well, let's hope that's the case.
Wait till you taste my virtual 1879 Madeira. You won't believe how great this is.
Oh, sold. That sounds fantastic. Noreen, what would tempt you into another metaverse?
I love this meta booze. This is great too.
I'm thinking of back when I was when I had my Second Life avatar going from one event to another, in the metaverse, and they had paywalls and things like that. So there are ways to kind of virtually geofence places. And I remember loving the idea that you can make these little things, that would be part of your character, part of your personality, or things that you could share with each other. And there was one point where I was having this event at the Information Architecture Institute, and we were at the end of the event, we had virtual buffet where you could pick up platters of things. And I had this little platter that I made with cucumber sandwiches and, Long Island iced tea and things like that. And then later on, I was at a Netroots Nation online conference with a bunch of I think it was 2008 candidates for office. And we were basically in this kind of auditorium outside. And everybody was kind of like bored because the speaker was a little late and we didn't know what to do. He started talking. And I just went into my little bag and I just pulled out my cucumber sandwiches and started like, it was fun. That was a lot of fun. I started sharing it. I was like, who wants a Long Island iced tea? And people were like, where'd you get that? I was like, oh, at the last thing that I was at. So that there are opportunities, I think, to do really quirky things, fun things. And, just recognizing that you're probably going to be tracked in there by whatever system is monitoring and giving you access to those spaces. So, you have to take care and be cognizant of that and be cognizant of who's in the room with you, so to speak. And also what's going on with your body, the whole haptic visual balance issues that Vint was talking about are going to be a real thing, I think. I do have a friend who is Regina Gilbert, who's at NYU, who's studying VR to help kids with accessibility issues. So they're actually using this as a way to kind of, explore, the treatments for children with mobility issues. And I think that that's also another really great place to do research right now. But you just have to really think about it, from our perspective today, where that trajectory is going and what biases we're bringing with us.
Noreen just brought up something that I find extremely appealing. And that's the possibility that we can provide to someone who has accessibility problems or mobility problems an experience that approximates, maybe just visually anyway and audibly, what it would be like to go on a safari somewhere. And I think even for people who don't have disabilities, a virtual safari might be a lot of fun. And I find that notion very appealing and very freeing, in the sense that we could bring an experience to someone that's not exactly the same as the real world, but it might be good enough that you would enjoy it and you would learn from it. And that would be a pretty good outcome.
Fantastic. Well, a quick change of pace. I thought we'd have some questions from the audience. So anyone with a question, put it into the chat, and the best ones I will ask.
Oliver, there are about 10,000 of them.
There are about 10,000, so we're going to be here all night. But
they've been just racing by, and there's some.
We'll do what we can in 10 minutes. This one I kind of liked because I'm interested in the answer. Which company or project have you both enjoyed the most?
This specific with regard to the metaverse, or just generally?
Anything at all, as you like.
Well, speaking for myself, the thing which I have found I've had more fun with than almost anything is the interplanetary extension of the internet. And that project is well underway. We've got standardized protocols. We're on the International Space Station. We're looking towards the return to the moon. We've already figured out what the configurations could look like on a Mars mission. So, I mean, this is real. This is engineering. This is not just speculation. And so for me, it's tremendously fun, having grown up on science fiction, the possibility that you could actually do something like this is really cool.
Definitely. Noreen, which companies have you really enjoyed, or projects?
I had the most fun when I gave a talk at the San Diego Supercomputing Center on mentoring. It was basically a Science Gateways Community Institute organization, lots of academic, it was very nerdy. And it was just so much fun to be talking to people who were developing data science interfaces, and kind of talking to them about how to make these spaces accessible. Yeah, talking to them about mentoring, because I'm also a very big proponent of mentoring. I enjoy when people can share what they learn. And, you know, I especially like to be mentored by people who are a little younger than I am, because they do have a different perspective, and often know so much more about, you know, things than I do. But that's probably the most fun that I had. And I have been involved with the Science Gateways Community Institute for a while. I've written a paper on accessibility in science gateways. And I'm always looking for opportunities like that, because it's really, these are people who are creating spaces that are, they're basically sharing knowledge with the world, but it needs to be in accessible ways. It needs to be in ways that people can actually do something with that data and make the world better.
So Noreen brings up this wonderful topic, and I want to emphasize two aspects of it. First one is that people with disabilities are often the most creative people around, because they have to cope with whatever their problems are. They have to figure out how to accommodate. And so I found people with disabilities are often the ones I turn to for creative thinking. That's the first point. The second one is that to the extent that you care about redressing accessibility problems and making things more accessible and useful, it turns out that you hear this statistic, 1 billion people in the world have a disability. That's the wrong number on which to account for the value of the work. And the reason for that is that for every disabled person of whatever disability they have, there are a whole bunch of other people who are benefited by helping the person that needs the help, so that they can be accommodated in the use of these technologies. And so the real benefit is not the 1 billion people with disabilities, but the other 6 billion or 7 billion people that they interact with. And so the power of what Noreen is talking about is amplified by the number of people who are benefited by a good response to accessibility needs.
Thanks for bringing that up. Really appreciate that. Our summer webinar is going to be on technology accessibility. You're
Great.
like right on. We're having you back, Vint and Noreen.
I'll be there.
Cool.
Let's see, another question. Do we think the metaverse is going to be able to help with wealth equality, which in a way is an inclusion question?
Yeah.
I mean, do we think the digital divide is simply too big at the moment to really include enough people?
I mean, I'm not super optimistic. I mean, I think there's a possibility that it will allow access to things just like the internet did, to things that are typically, only available to people of certain classes. One of the earliest projects, and this is another really fun one that I did in 1996, I got to go to the Pine Ridge Reservation and teach web design to middle school kids. And this opened up a world for them because they're living in the reservation. Many of them never leave, or they do leave, and they're like looking at websites from Australia. They're looking at, websites from all over the world, and they're building one that they know that people from Australia and other parts of the world are able to find online. And that was really, I think, very empowering for a lot of those kids. So that was like a real honor for me to be able to do that. And for me to start my career in that way, I think shaped a lot of, the projects that I chose from then on.
So two things occur to me. The first one is that there's no guarantee that this metaverse thing will necessarily have an effect on the digital divide or on the economic equality problem, which is quite severe. I mean, we are at the point now in our present day that the wealth disparity is approximately as bad as it was during the late 1800s. And at some point that's going to break. I mean, it cannot continue this way. The reason that we have this problem is outlined in a book by Alec Ross called The Roaring 2020s. And I would recommend that to you. Alec was a senior technical advisor to Hillary Clinton when she was Secretary of State. Some serious research on this topic. What's important here is that we have to recognize why wealth inequality happens. And the primary reason is that the current structure of capitalism lets people with any excess income get on an escalator. They can make investments, they can invest in stock, they can invest in companies. People who do not have any excess income, who are living paycheck to paycheck, never get on that escalator. We need to find a way to reward people who make companies valuable simply by their work. An example of this is the Gallup company, which is privately held and the employees own the company. And so what they get paid for their work, but they also benefit from ownership of the company. And so if its value increases because of their work, their holdings increase in value as well. And so all the members of the employees of the company benefit from the value of their work. So I anticipate the recognition of this will eventually cause us to rethink the way capitalism works, so as to open the doors for more people to benefit from its opportunities. At least I sincerely hope so.
Noreen, are you as optimistic that this could happen?
I think there is a lot of room for education in this area to really give everyone a chance, an opportunity to be part of that. And I don't know, I'm not sure, I'm kind of on the fence with it because a lot of it's really exciting and a lot of it just really feels like it's a road to that increased disparity, disparity between the wealthy classes and everyone else.
Hmm. Gosh, I feel like we need to end on a positive note. We've got a couple of minutes left.
Well, look, I mean, there is something positive to derive from all this, Oliver. For one thing, this is a new space in which to be creative. And there, there's just, and it's amazing. It's just software. But software is this amazing amplifying tool. You can that's what drew me into computing in the first place. The idea that you could create this world and it would do what you told it to do was absolutely, mesmerizing. And then later I figured out it does what I told it, not necessarily what I wanted it to do. And the difference between those is called a bug. And I discovered very early on how hard it is to find the mistakes that you made. But nonetheless, this is a huge canvas and an increasingly rich palette on which to paint new ideas. And so I anticipate that we will be surprised by some of the things that people discover they can do in this kind of an environment.
Fantastic. Well, that feels nice and uplifting, a nice point to end. Noreen, any last thoughts of what we're going to paint on this new and bright canvas?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like if we can bring back some of that, Skillshare craft, in the development, especially among younger generations, and really, pique their interest and excitement in building worlds and in building better worlds, I think that we're probably going to raise a lot of really interesting and effective people. And I really hope that my kids are part of that. And I'm looking forward to seeing what people can build.
Fantastic. Well, on to the future. Thank you both so much for a very, very interesting conversation. Unfortunately, we need to tie up as we're getting close to half an hour on the hour. Lauren, are you there? Do you want to end with some sponsor thanks?
Thank you, everyone, for coming. This was a really great webinar. We have a lot of chat. Bruce is going to put together the chat questions. I may have to send them back to Noreen and Vint. Thank you guys so much to maybe answer some. And we'll post everything on our meetup page. We love our members. We love our Disruptive Technologist members. I want to thank our sponsors, Esther Dyson, Ramona Wright, Greg King, Jeff Paul, and Scott Moss for supporting us. This is a really exciting year. I think things are going to start happening. As Vint, he's so prescient. We're going to have our summer webinars on technology accessibility. And I wanted to remind you to send your name, title, company, and email address to info@disruptivetechnologists.com. And that'll enter you into our email lottery for a chance to win Empowering Entrepreneurial Books by Rebecca Costa. And we're also giving away 2-day Upflex office passes from Ginger Diwali. And be sure to register for our second Metaverse webinar at the end of this month with Uber Angel Esther Dyson. We'll have another take on that. Thank you, everyone, for coming. And thanks, Vint and Noreen. You guys, big fans. Anyway, see you all in 2 weeks. Take care.
Thank you so much, everybody. Bye-bye for now.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.